Welcome to this video, which will walk you through the concept of Freytag's pyramid, which is a visual representation of the way that plot in fiction develops. So first of all, let's start off with why it's called Freytag's pyramid. There was a playwright in the 19th century called Gustav Freytag. He was a German, and he came up with this pyramid, and it's now used as a very common and easy way to show the development of plot in pretty much any piece of fiction that you care to mention. So we're going to look at plot in two different ways. One of the ways that we're going to look at it is going to be how plot develops purely from a sequence of events standpoint. And then the other way that we're going to look at it is in the relationship of the protagonist to the plot. So before we get started, there's three terms that we need to be familiar with because we're going to be using them. They're up here at the top: conflict, protagonist, and antagonist. Conflict, of course, is a disagreement, and there's lots of different kinds of conflicts that can be present in a work of fiction. Protagonist, of course, is the main character in the piece of fiction, the character that is struggling to solve some kind of problem. Sometimes we think of the protagonist as the hero. It's not usually quite that simple, but the protagonist is the main character and the person that we're most interested in the story. The antagonist, of course, is the person who stands in opposition to the protagonist, the person or the thing or the force that creates problems for the protagonist and gives him or her something to struggle against. So keep those terms in mind as we continue talking about plot. So when we start off talking about plot, the very first thing that generally happens in a piece of fiction is you get the exposition. And if you'll notice, the entirety of Freytag's pyramid looks kind of like a ski slope. And this first part here, the exposition, is flat. And a lot of times when people are starting to read a piece of fiction, they'll say, oh, this is kind of boring, I can't get into it. That's because generally the exposition is sort of the boring part. You have to get the background information to what's happening and sort of what's going on so you get a sense of what's happening in the story. So in general, when we talk about exposition, it's the place where the characters and the setting are introduced. We get a sense of where the story is happening, who's in it, sort of what's going on, so that we can then sort of enter the world of the story and then understand what's happening. So right here at this little star, this is generally where things start to get good in the story. We call that two different things. It sometimes is referred to as the narrative hook, and other times it's referred to as the inciting incident. So when you think about the term narrative hook, it's helpful to think about using a hook to catch a fish. If you go fishing and you have no hook and no bait on your hook and you just drop your line in the water, you're not going to catch anything. So the hook, the narrative hook, is the way that the author catches the reader and draws him or her into the story and kind of makes things exciting. And the word inciting sounds a little bit like exciting, but don't mix the two up. To incite means to kick something off or to start it. So when we talk about an inciting incident, it's an incident that occurs, something that happens in the story that incites or starts the central conflict. So this little part right here is where the central conflict really kicks off and everything gets started and we can really get into the meat of the story. So right here where the ski slope starts to go up, it is what it looks like. We call that the rising action. And we define that as a pretty decent sized chunk of the story or the novel in which the action becomes more intense, things become more tense for the protagonist, things are happening that are making life difficult for the protagonist. Generally, this is the place where there might be other complications that are thrown into the central conflict. So in a short story, usually you will really only see one central conflict because there's not a lot of space and time to get into additional conflicts. But in a novel, generally there'll be complications. There'll be other things that are going on, either as a result of the central conflict or in addition to the central conflict. If you're going to have subplots, smaller sort of parallel plots that are happening in the novel or the story, the rising action is generally where they're introduced. So things are becoming more and more intense and more complicated. So this rising action leads all the way up to the tippy top where we have the climax. And usually people understand the climax of a novel or a story is being the point at where the action is the most intense. If you're interested in the story at all, that's the place where you're going to be the most interested to see what's happening. So this is a very tense place, a very emotional place where things sort of come to a head. Falling action, the other side of the ski slope, is what it sounds like. It's where the action is falling. It's slowing down. Things are still happening. There's still action and things are still going on. So it's not completely resolved yet, but things are working towards a resolution when we get to the falling action. And then you get to the resolution, or the word underneath it, which is probably a new word to you. It's a fancy French word, denouement, which means unraveling. So resolution, we understand. When things are worked out, everything's more or less okay. Denouement is probably a new word. I told you a second ago that denouement means unraveling, and that's exactly what it means. So if you think about if you've tied a knot in a piece of rope or something, and you're trying to undo the knot, and you're picking at it and pulling at the different ends of the rope, trying to get the knot unraveled, and then you finally get the knot out, and then the piece of rope is all smooth. That's really what the denouement, or the resolution of a story, does. The central conflict is resolved, or at least mostly. It may not be worked out perfectly to where everybody's all sunshine and rainbows, but it's worked out enough that it's okay, and as readers we can kind of move on, and we can feel like there was a resolution to the conflict and it wasn't just left hanging. So that's the resolution, or the denouement. So I promised at the beginning of the video that we were going to look at Freytag's pyramid, not only in terms of the plot points and the sequence of events, but also in terms of what goes on with the main character, which, as you recall, is the protagonist. So let me take these little stickies off here, and I'm going to replace them with some purple stickies. Purple is for protagonist, so there you go. Okay, going back to the exposition, let's think about Freytag's pyramid in terms of what happens to our protagonist, because of course the protagonist is the center of the story. So everything that happens in the plot of the story revolves around a problem that this protagonist has. So the exposition, I told you that was where the characters and the setting are introduced, and it's also where we get introduced to what is known as the protagonist's status quo, and that may not be a term you're familiar with. It does come from Latin, and status quo means the way things usually are, the normal state of affairs. So before the protagonist starts to have problems, he or she is just kind of living life, everything's hunky-dory, it's just normal stuff, and that's the status quo. However, when we move over to the narrative hook or the inciting incident, that's where things kind of start to go wrong for the protagonist. Things start to happen that he or she is not particularly thrilled about. There's a problem that's introduced. Again, this is where we get our central conflict, and the protagonist gets kind of pulled into that and has to figure out how to solve whatever problem he or she is having. So in the rising action, I told you before that this is where things get more intense. In the rising action, the protagonist is struggling to solve the problem that is introduced down here in the narrative hook or the inciting incident. So the protagonist is trying to figure out how to get out of this mess, how to solve this problem. And generally, in a longer piece of fiction, complications are going to be introduced. Either sort of problems that are happening parallel to the main problem, or that are offshoots of the main problem, and things just get worse and worse and more complicated. If you think back to over here with the resolution or the denouement, we said that a denouement is an unraveling. Think of the rising action as the place where the knot is getting tied in that rope. That's where things are getting all messed up, and the protagonist is trying to smooth them out. So action gets more intense, things get worse and worse and worse and more complicated until we get to the tippy top at the climax. And this is a really important part of the story for the protagonist. This is where the protagonist is going to make some kind of decision, and it's going to be a really crucial decision that changes the course of the rest of the story. So picture maybe in like a TV show or a movie, maybe there's a chase and somebody is running down an alley and they get to the end of the alley and there's no escape, and they turn around and whoever was chasing them is there, and they have to figure out, oh my gosh, I'm backed into a corner, what am I going to do? So the climax is kind of like that. The protagonist is put in a position, sometimes it's a literal physical position and other times it's more figurative. The protagonist is put in a position where he or she has got to act, he or she is forced to act. And that decision that they make at that moment changes the course of the rest of the story. So, falling action. Things slow down. But in terms of the character development of the protagonist, what happens here is the consequences of the protagonist's choice are explored. So up here in the climax, we said that the protagonist makes some kind of decision, is forced into a position where he or she has to act. And if he or she does this thing, the story will go one way, and if he or she does this other thing, it'll go the other way. So the falling action looks at what happens as a result of the choice. Whatever the choice was, this is the consequences or the outcomes of that choice. Down here at the end again with the resolution or the denouement, it's pretty much what we said before. Things are worked out or mostly worked out, at least to the point where we as readers feel satisfied and we can move on with the story and it's not left hanging. And as far as the protagonist is concerned, this is also kind of the reflective piece where the protagonist has learned some kind of lesson or has gained some kind of insight into himself or somebody else or the world in general, and is going to move on sort of wiser. Generally, when we think about a protagonist, a term that we could have put up here that we didn't is dynamic character. Protagonists are generally dynamic characters that experience some sort of change or growth, and the thing that brings about their change or growth is the struggle that they go through over the course of the story or the novel or whatever it is. So when you think about the Freytag's pyramid, think about it not only in terms of this happens, this happens, this happens, but think about it as a tool for how the protagonist is going to change and learn and grow. Just like you change and learn and grow by going through difficulties and struggles in your own life, protagonists in fiction do the same thing. So when you think back on this video, remember that purple is the protagonist. These are the things that happen to the protagonist throughout the piece of fiction. And the yellow stickies that I used earlier just relate solely to the events themselves and how they unfold. So I hope that this video was informational, and I hope it was helpful to you in understanding how fictional plots progress. Thanks so much.